Hi again, and welcome back to the Learn to Code by Writing Space Invaders course. We've now made it to lesson number 12, and I think it's about time that we got some aliens on the screen. So let's get straight into it by moving into our code. To get the aliens into our code, we're going to have to consider how we're going to store the data for aliens in our software. In other words, how we're going to represent them, and then how we're going to represent the whole grid of aliens on the screen and move those around. So if we think about a single alien, we can design a new alien object which will hold the variables and data that will represent the alien in our software. So looking at that in a very similar way to which we did the player ship and player bullet, we're going to need to store some position information which tells our code where on the screen this particular alien exists. So we'll have again our position subobject with the x and y coordinates. But we'll also need some way of telling the system whether this particular alien is dead or alive. So we can create another alive variable and put that inside our alien object as well. So we can use this basic template as a starting point for our new alien object. But if we now look at the end game screen, we'll see that we're going to have to scale our ideas up a bit to cope with a full grid of 48 aliens. So we now need to consider how we're going to represent the full alien fleet in our software. So if we look a bit closer at the way our fleet is organised, we'll see that it's really built up of rows, so a number of rows of aliens, and then each of these rows is split into a number of columns. So each individual alien can be thought of as one element in a row of 8 aliens. We already know that we can store a set of objects using an array, just the same way that we did with our multiple bullets for the player firing system. So we can create a row array which will contain 8 elements or 8 slots, and each of those will contain one alien object. So going back to our full grid of aliens then, we can see that that's really built up of a number of rows of aliens. So to represent this in our software, we can really use exactly the same idea that we did for the rows. In other words, we can use an array. An array simply creates a number of slots into which we can place a piece of data, and it doesn't actually matter if that piece of data happens to be an array itself. So we can actually create an array of arrays, and that will give us our two-dimensional grid of alien objects. So our aliens array will actually contain 6 slots, and each of those slots or elements will be a row, which will then be its own array of 8 individual alien objects. But we now need to work out that within our full grid of 48 aliens, how do we identify a single alien in our new array within array structure? Well, we know that our aliens variable is an array of rows of aliens. So the alien that's currently highlighted is in row number 5. And as each element in our aliens array represents a row, we must be looking at element 5 of our aliens variable. So aliens square bracket 5 will give us the 5th element in our aliens array, which will actually be the row that we're looking for. So if we then look at this row, we know that that's actually another array of alien objects, and the one we want is element number 3. So we can then simply add at the end of our expression inside square brackets number 3. So we now have our expression to access this particular alien as our aliens variable, element number 5 from that, which gives us the row, and then element number 3 from that row, which will give us our individual alien object. So if you think about it, we've actually created a two-dimensional matrix of aliens. And arrays allow us to do this, and we could, if we want, go on even further and say we created an array which would contain a number of alien grids. So in other words, an array containing a number of two-dimensional arrays. And that would then give us a three-dimensional array, and so on. So let's have a look at how we can code this aliens array. So I've gone into TIC80, and as normal, we're going to load in our previous lessons code. I'm going to load in lesson 12, and then I'm going to save that as lesson 13 so that we've got everything saved. Coming into our code then, and then changing that to 13. So we know that we need to set up our data storage for these aliens. So let's come down here and let's start looking at putting some information into our code. So this top bit here is to do with our player ship and our player bullets. So after that, then let's come in here and let's start looking at our alien data storage. So we know that we're going to need this aliens array. So let's initialize it to this empty table. In other words, it's now an empty array ready to take our information. We know that we're going to have to add some rows and columns, but it'd be good if we were able to adjust those to whatever size we want. So again, in our normal way, we're going to put those in as variables instead of embedding the actual number in our code. So we're going to say alien rows. So how many rows do we want to have for the aliens? And let's say we're going to have 6 rows. And alien columns. And let's say we're going to have our 8 columns of aliens. So we've now got everything set up. All we need to do is to create our alien objects inside our aliens array so that they all then exist and we're able to start working with them. So let's look at how we can initialize this aliens array. So if we scroll down a bit, we know, if you remember from our previous work, we created this initialize game function, which is where we would kick off all of the initialization that needs to be done at the very start of the game. So if we scroll down to that one then, and find our initialize game function. So we have at the moment initialize game, and at the moment all it does is initialize our player bullets array. So what we'll do is we will then create a new function to initialize our aliens, and we'll call it init aliens, and that will handle putting all of the alien objects inside our aliens array. So if we then put it in here, so we have our player bullet initialization function. So that's underneath that. Let's create our function init aliens and put in our end statement so we know where that finishes at. And let's have a think about how we're going to initialize our aliens array. We know that our aliens array is going to end up being one of these two-dimensional arrays with a number of rows and columns of aliens to make up this sort of alien matrix. And each of those elements is going to be an actual alien object. So there's really two ways of approaching this design. One is to approach it from the idea of the two-dimensional array and working our way down to individual aliens. Or, as we're going to use in this time, we're going to work from the individual alien and work our way back out to the two-dimensional array. So we're going to use our little comments to add little bits of pseudocode, which will prompt us and help us design this block. So let's give ourselves a little bit of space in here. And we know at some point we're going to have to create an alien. So we will have to have some code that will create the actual alien object that's going to take its place in this alien grid. So that's going to be where we put the individual alien creation bit. If we then work one step back, if you remember when we drew the diagram, we saw that a row of aliens was simply a collection of 8 aliens, one in each of the columns in that row. So going back to our alien bullets, sorry, our player bullets array, remember that we used a for loop to simply block together a number of objects into a single array. So we're going to have to be able to create a row of aliens. So we want to create a row. Let me just put a space in here. A row of aliens, pardon me, and that will be around our create a single alien. So that will be end a row. Okay. Once we've created a row of aliens, we saw that our alien grid was simply then a number of these rows put together in their own array. So we'll end up doing our create alien grid will simply be then creating a number of rows and putting them together in an array. Oh. So, tidy that up there. So, we're going to have a piece of code which is the creating an alien object, and we know that that's just simply creating a table and assigning the various variables inside that table to make up an object. To put 8 aliens together, we know that our create row of aliens is going to be a for loop, which is simply going to go round 8 times, sticking together or putting 8 aliens into a single array. The new bit then is the idea that we can just take the row and treat that as just simply another object. And we can then do exactly the same process with our alien grid, where we're going to simply put together 6 rows of aliens into our final aliens array. So our aliens array will be created using a for next loop, which is going to put together 6 rows. Each of those rows then is going to be a for next loop putting together 8 aliens. And that will give us this idea of the nested for loops, which will end up going, so our inner loop here will go round 8 times to make one row, and we will then do that 6 times to create our 6 rows of 8 aliens. So let's have a go at writing that out and see if we can put this block of code together. So let's start by writing the code that's going to create a single alien. So we know that we're going to be putting this alien into our aliens array. And we know that it's a 2-dimensional array, so we will need 2 indexes to reference both the row and the column into which it's going to go. So we're going to just leave those blank for now until we work out what goes in there. And that's going to then be equal to one of these tables. And we've already said that in our table, we're just going to start off by putting in a position sub-object. And that's going to have an X variable, which we're just going to set to 0 for now. And a Y variable, which again we'll set to 0. We then said the last thing we're going to put in here is an alive variable, and we're going to set that equal to true to say that this particular alien is alive. So we're going to create an alien, and we're going to put it inside our aliens 2-dimensional array, so our aliens matrix. We're going to need 2 indexes to reference both the row and the column. And then we're simply going to make that equal to this idea of another object. So exactly the same as we've done with our player ship and player bullets. We're going to use a Lua table, and we're going to create a subtable for the position, and then just a separate variable then inside our table for whether this alien's alive or not. And that's the code then that generates the actual alien object. So looking at creating a row then, we know that a row is simply an array of 8 aliens. So let's have a look at creating that. So to create a row then, we know that we're going to use a for loop. And what we're doing is we're basically putting each alien object into a column in this row. So let's use our for loop, but let's create a variable called column. So for column equals column 1, and the limit then, again, we defined that a bit further up in our code here. So let's have a look back up where we define things. And we said we were going to have two variables. Alien rows tells us how many rows, and alien columns tells us how many columns. So let's come back here to initialize aliens. Okay, so we know that we're going from, for column equals 1 to alien columns, and that will count up to the right amount. We're going to do, and we're going to create an alien and put it into the aliens array, and then that will end this row. So that end will be the end of our for. So apart from this bit where we're actually specifying exactly which element in our two-dimensional aliens array we're going to put this object into, we've got our row filling for loop completed. We now need to look at our alien grid area, where we're actually going to create then up to 6 rows of aliens. So again, we're going to have some sort of for loop in this one, and this one's going to be creating our rows. So let's call this our row counter. So for row counter equals 1, and then it was alien rows was the variable we'd set to tell us how many rows to create. So we have our for loop going there, and again that's got to then encompass this whole other for loop. So we're going to have a for loop inside a for loop, and we want to then do our end down here, and that is the end of our alien grid for loop. So we now have 2 indices which are going to count through the rows, and then within each row the column. So we have our outer for loop is counting up our rows, and the current row we're working on is indexed by this row variable. When we're working on that row, then this inner for loop is going to use this variable column to reference each of the individual columns within that row. So let's start working towards filling in these, and we'll start up here with what's happening to the actual variables. So we know that up at the top of the listing in the initialization area, we created a variable called aliens, which we set to an empty table. So once we get to this point here, the aliens array is actually a completely empty table. It doesn't contain anything at all. So when we start to work through the rows, those rows don't exist. So we actually need to create them. So inside here, we need to actually make the aliens array. So our aliens array, and then same as we did for the bullets, we need to make the index pointed to by our row counter. So the first instance that'll be 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So aliens row, we need to set that equal to an empty table so that it's then able to hold the various columns. So that creates this alien row, so the row pointed to by our row variable, as an empty table. That means then that our column counter can start putting these alien objects into the individual cells. So down here where we're going to reference where we're putting this alien object. We're working on our row. So remember, our row comes first. So aliens row, same as up here. We'll select the row we're working on. And then in the second brackets, that's where we have to specify which column we want to put this alien into. So, and that is pointed to by our column variable. So we now have a block of code which will fill up our aliens array with these alien objects. So again, just to run through that, our outer loop counts the rows. We have to create that row and make it into an empty table. Our inner loop then takes that row, and in every single column of that row, so remember, aliens row gives us the row we're working on, the column index of that row gives us the individual alien, and we then put an alien object into that into that box. So we've now got a piece of code which should hopefully then create our alien array and put an alien in every single area of that array. As yet we can't test it obviously because we haven't got anything to show them on the screen, but let's at least test it to make sure that there's no typing errors in our code. So if we try and run that, we should find that our code is working as normal. But what should have happened now is we should have inside the software created this aliens array and actually filled it up with alien objects. So the next stage then is to get these aliens displaying on the screen. And we're going to do that in the next lesson. So make sure that you save your work. So I've already saved mine as lesson number 13 at the start of the lesson. So I can just hit Control S and that will save it for me. If you didn't save it at the start, make sure you press the escape key and save lesson 13. And then I will see you in lesson 14 where we'll start displaying the aliens on the screen. See you soon. Bye. Don't forget to visit the course pages for this project. There you'll be able to download the code for this lesson and get lots of extra hints and tips. You'll also get access to all my other programming, electronics and gaming projects. All the links are in the description below. For more games programming, electronics projects and retro gaming, please make sure you like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel and visit my website.